The doors of the high chamber sealed behind me with a sound like a last breath being let out, and I understood before a single word was spoken that my people had already been condemned. My name is Elias Crane, and on that day I was 26 years old, standing alone inside a ring of pale light while 9 judges looked down at me from thrones carved into the far wall. I was not a criminal. I was not a soldier answering for one act of violence. I stood there as the voice of every human being alive, and the enormity of that pressed the strength straight out of my legs. The air in that place smelled of cold iron and something faintly sweet, like sugar left too long over a flame. I learned later that this was simply how the atmosphere tasted aboard their vessels. Around me stood envoys from 6 worlds, not one of them human, all of them watching me the way a person watches a fire that has crept too near their home. "Elias Crane of Earth," said the presiding judge, a towering figure with skin like smoothed granite and eyes that never once closed. "You have heard what was brought against you. Do you deny it?" I did not deny it. How could I? 3 months earlier, a human survey vessel named the Meridian had drifted into a region of space no chart of ours had ever touched, a quiet stretch of the void that belonged, according to ancient treaties none of us had ever been shown, to a species called the Sethari. The Meridian's captain, a decent man named John Rourke, had no idea he was breaking any law. His instruments read nothing. His maps showed only emptiness, but the Sethari held that region sacred, forbidden, and when their patrol ships closed in on the Meridian, something failed in the very first seconds of contact. No human alive knows exactly what set it off. We still don't, 2 centuries on. Some believe a signal was misread. Some believe the Sethari fired first out of terror. Whatever the truth was, 3 of their ships were torn apart and 11 of their people never returned home. Humanity had belonged to the wider galaxy for only 9 years by then, 9 years of trade, of cautious meetings, of trying to prove we were worth knowing at all. And in a single afternoon, every bit of that was erased. "We do not deny that the incident occurred," I said, holding my voice level even as my hands trembled at my sides. "We ask only that you weigh us by everything we are, not by one tragedy born of confusion." The granite-skinned judge tilted his head, and for the space of a breath I thought I saw something close to pity cross his face. It did not last. "Your full record, Elias Crane, is precisely the problem," he said. "In 9 years, your species has displayed more capacity for violence, more speed of expansion, and more unpredictability than any species we have catalogued across 10,000 years of history. You did not simply err. You confirmed what a great many of us already feared." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell them about the billions of us who had never so much as held a weapon, who spent their days growing food and raising children and writing songs. I wanted to tell them that condemning 11 billion people for one terrible afternoon was not justice but fear dressed in the robes of law. But I had been warned before I entered. Anger would only prove their case. So instead I asked quietly, "What is it you mean to do with us?" There was a long silence. Then the judge spoke the words that would bend the fate of my entire species. "Effective at once, Earth and all its colonies are placed beneath the Shroud Protocol. A dampening lattice will be raised around your star, reaching to the very edge of your outer cloud. No vessel will cross it in either direction. No signal stronger than raw light and radio will pass through it. You will keep whatever you already possess within your system today, but you will receive nothing further, no contact, no trade, no teaching from the wider galaxy. This carries no expiration. Elias Crane, this is a quarantine. You will remain behind the shroud until the Accord decides, if ever, that your kind has become safe to release." The sound that left my mouth was not quite a word. It was nearer to the noise a person makes when the floor vanishes beneath them. "For how long?" I finally managed. "Give me a number, a generation, too, something we can hold on to." The judge looked almost sorry as he answered, "There is no number, there is only proof." "And proof, Elias Crane, is the one thing your species has never been able to offer us. 2 guards escorted me out. They never touched me, but they walked close enough that the meaning was plain. On the landing platform, I looked up into the sky of that alien world, violet and strange, crowded with ships from 6 species going calmly about their business as though humanity were already a footnote rather than a living thing about to be locked away. The vessel that carried our delegation home was silent the entire way. Nobody spoke. Nobody wept, not yet. We were all doing the arithmetic in our heads, trying to imagine what a solar system with no exit would actually feel like once the door had shut. We reached Earth 11 days later. I remember standing on an observation deck beside an engineer named Vera Sato, watching through the wide port as the shroud began. It did not look violent. It did not look like a wall slamming into place. At first it looked like a shimmer, a thin ripple of light spreading outward from a dozen alien construction rigs stationed just past Neptune. Vera gripped the rail until her knuckles went bloodless. "It's beautiful," she whispered. And I knew exactly what she meant, because it was beautiful, and that made it so much worse. Something so gentle was about to sever 11 billion people from everyone else who had ever lived. "How long do you think it'll hold?" she asked. I had no honest answer, so I gave her the only one I had. Long enough that we'd better learn to live without them. Over the weeks that followed, the shimmer thickened into something solid, something you could see even by daylight if you knew where to look, a faint silver line drawn across the top of the sky like a scar. The last alien ships departed one by one. I stood on a rooftop in a coastal city and watched a sleek Sethari vessel, one that had once brought us medicine and star charts in the name of friendship, rise without hesitation, turn toward the edge of the system, and refuse to look back. No ceremony. No farewell. They simply left the way you leave a room you no longer wish to sit in. That night, for the first time in 9 years, Earth's arrays picked up nothing from beyond the system's edge. Not a signal, not a transponder. Only silence, deep and complete, stretching in every direction like an ocean with no far shore. I sat with my father that evening, an old schoolteacher named Samuel Crane who had spent his whole life certain that humanity's finest days were still ahead of us, out there among the stars. He said very little. He poured 2 cups of tea, handed me one, and looked out the window at the sky. "They think this is the end of us," he said at last. "Isn't it?" I asked, and I meant it. I was young enough and frightened enough to believe a species cut off from all others might simply thin out and fade until it was gone. My father shook his head slowly, and there was something in his eyes I would not fully understand until I was an old man myself, watching a very different kind of ship climb into the sky. "No," he said, "this is the end of who we were pretending to be for them. Now we find out who we actually are when nobody is watching, when nobody is judging, and when there is nowhere left to run except forward." I did not sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the wind, thinking about the silence beyond the shroud, about the 11 billion of us sealed inside one small system, while a galaxy of trillions moved on without us. I believed we had lost everything. I did not yet understand that we had only lost the parts of ourselves that had never mattered, and that everything we would need to survive, to grow, and one day to return was already inside us, waiting for a reason to wake. The shroud finished closing 3 days later. From that morning on, for 200 years, no human being would see another star up close, shake the hand of another species, or hear a voice from beyond our own small corner of the dark. We were alone, and though none of us could see it yet, standing in the first cold days of our exile, that loneliness was about to become the forge that beat us into something the galaxy had never expected, and would one day come to fear far more than it ever feared the crew of a single lost survey ship. The first 10 years behind the shroud were the hardest, and I don't say that lightly, because I lived through all 200 of them, kept alive by medicine I'll explain in time. Food shortages struck in the very first winter. The trade routes that had once carried rare minerals and finished parts from other worlds vanished overnight, and our factories, built to lean on those imports, fell quiet one by one. I watched cities that had grown brighter every year slide back into darkness, because there was no longer enough power to keep every lamp burning. Vera Sato, the engineer who had stood beside me on that deck, became one of the most important people alive during those years, though almost no one outside her own lab ever knew her name. She led a team that took apart every scrap of alien technology we had gathered during our 9 years of contact, not to copy it exactly, but to understand the principles beneath it and rebuild them from materials we actually had. It was slow, brutal work, full of failures that cost lives when early reactors ran hot or early ships lost power mid-flight. But it was also the beginning of something our jailers never predicted, because they had always taught new species slowly and carefully, holding knowledge back until they judged a people ready for it. We had no such luxury. We had no patient teacher standing over our shoulders telling us to wait. We had hunger and darkness, and a very simple choice between learning fast or not learning at all. I visited Vera's lab once during my early work coordinating supplies between cities. She was thinner than she had been, her hair already streaked with gray though she was barely past 30, and there were burn scars on her hands she never bothered to hide. "We finally understand the drive core," she told me, and there was a light in her eyes I hadn't seen since before the shroud. "Not the way they built it. Better. Ours is heavier, but it doesn't fail the way theirs did." "Better how?" I asked. She smiled, exhausted but proud. "Their systems were built to be safe first and powerful second, because they had 1,000 years to be patient. We don't have 1,000 years, Elias. So we built ours to be powerful first, and we're learning to make it safe as we go." That single sentence, more than anything else, captures what happened to us in those first decades. We were not imitating some graceful, patient civilization. We were a desperate people racing our own hunger and fear, and that desperation turned out to be a strange kind of gift, because it stripped away every slow habit, every needless caution, every rule that existed only because it always had. By the 20th year, the worst of the shortages had passed. New reactors built from Vera's reworked designs lit cities that had gone dark. Farms recovered, using alien agricultural science folded into old human methods that had never quite been replaced. For the first time since those chamber doors closed on me, I let myself believe we might actually survive. But survival was never going to be enough for us, and I think that's the thing the Accord never understood. A frightened, isolated people does not simply settle into quiet acceptance. It hunts for meaning, for purpose, for something to build toward. And we found that purpose in a project that began almost by accident. It started with a stubborn old military engineer named Aaron Voss, a man with a short temper who had lost his brother in a shortage accident that first winter and never quite forgave the galaxy for leaving us to it. Long before most people were ready to hear it, Aaron believed the shroud would not last forever, and that when it finally weakened or broke, humanity had to be ready for whatever came through, rescue, or another kind of judgment. They mocked him at first. They called him paranoid, obsessed, a man chasing ghosts instead of rebuilding farms and hospitals like everyone else. But Aaron kept working, quietly gathering a handful of engineers and scientists who agreed that hope alone was not a plan. Among them was a brilliant young woman named Lena Marsh, barely out of university, with a gift for materials science that even Vera Sato admitted she had never seen matched. Lena's early work centered on hull plating, an unglamorous subject most people ignored. But she attacked it with an obsession that reminded me of my own father's stubborn faith in a future worth preparing for. She spent years testing alloys, failing, testing again, sleeping in her lab more nights than in her own bed. By the time she was 30, her plating outperformed anything the Accord had ever shown us, not because she had better materials, but because she had something they didn't. An entire species working without limits, without a cautious teacher telling her to slow down and follow the accepted method. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters. Those years were not only about brilliant engineers making breakthroughs in quiet labs. They were also about ordinary people, farmers and teachers and parents, holding communities together through fear and loss. A woman named Alice Renner ran a small school in a mountain town that had lost half its grid during the second winter, and she kept that school open every single day, teaching children by candlelight when the generators failed, because she believed fiercely that a generation raised without hope was a generation that would never fight for one. I met her many years later, an old woman by then, and she told me something I never forgot. They thought cutting us off would make us small, she said. They should have known that when you corner a person, you either break them or you make them dangerous. They just never understood which kind of species we were. By the 40th year, we had done something the judges would never have believed possible. We were not merely surviving behind the shroud. We were thriving, in a hard, strange way, building a civilization shaped entirely by our own choices rather than the careful guidance of older species. Our cities grew efficient rather than beautiful. Our governments grew simpler and more unified out of pure necessity. And our military, born from fear of what might one day come through the barrier, grew into something disciplined and quietly formidable, even with almost nothing to test itself against beyond old simulations and the occasional dangerous experiment gone wrong. It was in the 60th year that something happened which changed the direction of everything, and it began, of all places, with a mistake in Vera Sato's old lab, now run by her former student, a careful and methodical man named David Klein. David had been pushing a modified drive core past its intended limits, hoping to shorten travel times between Earth and the colonies still clinging to survival on Mars and in the belt. During one late test, a small unmanned prototype built only to collect data briefly grazed the inner face of the shroud itself while correcting course. Nothing dramatic happened. The ship didn't explode. It didn't vanish. But for exactly 4 seconds, its sensors recorded a fluctuation in the shroud's energy signature, a tiny flicker in a field that had held perfectly stable for 60 years. David brought the data to Aaron Voss himself, and the two of them stayed awake through the night poring over the readings. What they found gave us the first real hope we had felt since the day the barrier closed. The dampening field, powerful as it was, had never been built to withstand direct, sustained pressure from the inside. It had been raised to contain a primitive, struggling species without effort, the way a fence holds sheep, not soldiers. Nobody on the other side had ever imagined that in 60 short years, the species trapped within would build technology able to strain that fence at all. "It isn't a door," Aaron said that night, his voice shaking with an emotion I never saw in him before or after. "Not yet, but it's a seam, and seams can be widened." Word of the discovery spread carefully, shared only among trusted scientists and military leaders, because the last thing anyone wanted was false hope racing through a population still healing from decades of hardship. I was brought into that circle not long after, given my role coordinating the scattered colonies, and I remember the meeting where Aaron laid out his plan with a calm certainty that surprised everyone in the room. "We are not going to break the shroud by force," he said. "Not for a long time, maybe not for 100 years. But we are going to understand it, piece by piece, the same way we understood the drive core, the same way Lena understood hull plating. And when the day comes that we are truly ready, that seam is going to become our door." I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest since I first heard the news. And what happens when we walk through it? What happens when the Accord realizes we didn't wait for their permission? Aaron looked at me a long moment, and I remember the small, tired smile that crossed his face. The same smile I would see again decades later, on a very different kind of day, aboard a ship none of us could have imagined back then. Then they're going to have to decide, he said, whether they want to negotiate with the species they threw away, or whether they want to find out exactly what 200 years of being underestimated is capable of building. None of us knew that night that his number would prove almost exactly right. None of us could have guessed how long the road ahead truly was, how many more discoveries and losses and quiet sacrifices it would take to turn that 4-second flicker into something powerful enough to change the fate of every human alive. But for the first time in 60 years, standing in that dim, crowded room full of tired, determined faces, I felt something I had nearly forgotten how to feel. I felt hope. Not the soft, fragile kind that waits for someone else to come and save you, but the hard, patient kind that gets up every single morning and keeps building anyway, because it has decided, quietly and completely, that the future belongs to those willing to earn it themselves. By the time I turned 100, a number that would have sounded impossible to my father's generation, I had stopped counting the years as a burden and started counting them as evidence. Medicine developed during the Shroud years, built on the scraps of alien biology we had gathered during our brief contact, had stretched human life far past anything our ancestors imagined. I was not unusual for my time. I was simply one of billions who had lived long enough to watch a civilization rebuild itself from nothing into something the rest of the galaxy would soon find impossible to ignore. The century mark felt like a turning point, not for any single event, but because it was the moment I looked around at the world I had grown old inside and realized it no longer resembled the hungry planet of my youth. Earth's old divisions had simply dissolved. There had been no grand treaty, no single day of unification, only the slow, quiet fact that a species facing extinction by isolation could not afford to waste energy on old rivalries. Resources were shared because they had to be. Knowledge was shared because hoarding it while the whole species faced an uncertain future came to feel like a foolish kind of pride nobody could afford. By my 100th year, Earth operated under a single coordinated government, not because anyone had been forced into it, but because the alternative had stopped making sense generations earlier. Our culture had changed too, in ways that surprised even those of us who had lived through every step. With no wider galaxy watching, judging, offering slow lessons and cautious trade, we turned entirely inward and upward at once. Inward toward relentless self-improvement, upward toward the stars we could still see but not yet reach. Schools no longer merely taught children to read and calculate. They taught engineering alongside history, the story of the tribunal and the shroud beside basic mathematics, so that every child grew up knowing exactly what had been taken from us and exactly what it would cost to take it back. I visited a school once, not far from where Alice Renner had taught by candlelight, now a gleaming building full of children working on real engineering projects that fed directly into the colony programs. A boy of maybe 10 proudly showed me a small working model of an improved reactor housing, something that would have been advanced research only decades before. When I asked why he'd chosen that project, he looked at me with a seriousness that startled me in someone so young. "Because someday we're going to need it," he said simply. "When we finally get to go out there again." That sentence, spoken so plainly by a child, caught something essential about what we had become. We were no longer merely surviving. We were preparing, every one of us in ways large and small, for a return that most people believed, with total certainty, would eventually come. Our military doctrine, meanwhile, had grown into something unlike anything the wider galaxy had built, precisely because it had developed with no outside influence at all. Where the little alien doctrine we'd glimpsed had prized caution, hierarchy, and careful adherence to established protocol, ours grew from centuries of human history full of sudden change, rapid invention, and constant adaptation to threats no one saw coming. We trained not to follow a single perfect plan, but to change instantly the moment a plan failed, because every human soldier, whether they had ever seen real combat or not, had grown up on the stories of those first desperate years, when survival itself depended on exactly that kind of flexibility. Lena Marsh, the young materials scientist from Aaron's original circle, was in her 60s by then, still working, still restless, now leading an entire division devoted to hull and armor for what everyone quietly understood would one day become a real fleet, ships built for far more than ferrying colonists. I visited her workshop often in those years, partly for reports, partly because I had come to think of her as a friend, one of the few left who remembered those early frightened days as clearly as I did. "You know what the strange part is," she said one afternoon, running her hand along a section of the newest plating, dark and faintly textured in a way that seemed to swallow light rather than throw it back. "Every improvement we've made, every breakthrough exists because nobody ever told us it was impossible. The Accord spent 1,000 years perfecting their designs, testing every small change for decades before they trusted it. We don't have that patience. And honestly, Elias, I don't think we ever will. We test, we fail, we lose people sometimes, and then we fix it and move forward. It's a harder way to build, but I think in the end it might be a better one." I did not fully grasp how right she was until the year our first true scout ships were finally ready to test the seam Aaron Voss had discovered decades before. By then, Aaron himself had passed, an old man surrounded by the students and engineers who had carried his obsession forward into something real. His granddaughter, a sharp and quietly fierce woman named Iris Voss, had taken over the project that had once been dismissed as one stubborn man's paranoid hobby. Under Iris, decades of careful study of the shroud's energy patterns had finally produced something remarkable: a narrow, precisely calculated method of slipping a small, heavily shielded vessel through the field without tripping the massive automatic responses everyone assumed the Accord had built in as a final safeguard. I was present, along with Iris and a small group of senior officers, in the control room the night the first scout attempted the crossing. The tension in that room was unlike anything I had felt since I stood in the tribunal chamber over a century earlier, listening to strangers decide our fate. This time, though, the fear was laced with something else, a fierce, quiet resolve that had been building inside our species for generations. The ship, small and unmanned, guided by systems more advanced than anything the galaxy had ever shown us, approached the calculated point with careful precision. For a moment, every reading on every screen seemed to freeze, and I held my breath along with everyone else, half expecting the field to lash out and tear the ship apart the way we had always feared. Instead, the little vessel simply passed through, its systems flickering briefly before steadying, its sensors immediately transmitting data from a stretch of space no human eyes had seen in more than 140 years. The room broke into a kind of quiet, disbelieving joy I find hard to describe even now. Iris Voss, usually so composed, sat down heavily and just stared at the screen for a long moment before she finally spoke. "We did it," she whispered. "Grandfather, we actually did it." But what that scout found on the far side of the shroud changed the entire direction of our plans, and not in the way any of us had expected. We had always assumed, quietly, fearfully, that the galaxy beyond our prison had kept moving forward during our long isolation, growing stronger, more advanced, more powerful, exactly as it had been when the tribunal first sealed us away. What the scout's sensors revealed instead was something none of us had prepared for. Drifting not far past the shroud's outer edge was an old Accord monitoring post, one of the stations placed there generations before to watch for exactly this kind of breach. Its systems, by the scout's scans, were badly dated, running on technology that in some ways lagged behind what we had already built on our own. Its defenses were minimal, clearly designed for a threat the Accord had long since stopped taking seriously. Iris ordered a wider sweep, and over the following weeks, as more careful scout runs slipped through the seam and returned safely, a clearer picture formed. The wider galaxy had not spent the last century and a half racing forward the way we had feared. If anything, much of Accord space had settled into a comfortable, unchallenged stillness. A civilization so secure in its position, so certain no threat remained that could test it, that innovation itself had slowed to a crawl. I remember the meeting where this was presented to the full defense command, and the tangle of emotions in that room was almost impossible to sort out. There was relief, certainly. The realization that the galaxy we had feared for so long was not the unstoppable, endlessly advancing force we had imagined. But there was something colder too, something that took longer to settle into words. A young officer, barely 30, finally said what many of us were already thinking. "They stopped growing because they stopped needing to," she said. "They exiled the one species that scared them, and then they just relaxed. They've been standing still, while we've been running as fast as we possibly could for over 100 years." The debate that followed ran for months, spreading beyond the military into the highest levels of Earth's unified government. Some argued for caution, for continuing to build and study quietly for another generation or two before making any move, worried that revealing our progress too soon might trigger exactly the fear that had gotten us exiled in the first place. Others, myself among them, began to argue for something bolder, though not reckless, a controlled, deliberate step forward rather than decades more of hiding behind a seam only we knew existed. I stood before that council, an old man by then though still strong and clear-headed thanks to our medicine, and made the argument that would eventually shape everything that followed. We were exiled for being unpredictable and fast, I told them. We spent 140 years proving that judgment wasn't entirely wrong. We are unpredictable. We are fast. But we use that nature to survive, to build, to become something worth respecting instead of something worth fearing. If we hide forever, we prove nothing except that their fear worked. I don't believe that's the story we want written about our species, not after everything we sacrificed to get here. It took several more years of careful preparation before the council agreed on a path. Years spent quietly expanding our scout operations, mapping the nearest reaches of Accord space, gathering intelligence, and most importantly, finishing something that had existed only as blueprints and half-built prototypes for decades. A true fleet, built entirely by human hands, shaped by 2 centuries of hard-won lessons no outside teacher had ever guided us through. I was there, on a viewing platform above the great orbital yards, the night the final vessel was completed. It was named the Dawn Unbroken, chosen by public vote across every human colony, and as its running lights flickered on for the first time against the black, I felt something shift in my chest that I had been waiting over a century to feel. We were no longer merely survivors, huddled behind a barrier raised by strangers who had judged us unworthy. We had become something entirely new, forged in isolation, tempered by hardship, shaped by 200 years of refusing to accept that exile was the end of our story. Standing there, watching the fleet gather into formation for the first time, I thought back to my father's words on the evening the shroud first closed, words I had carried through every dark year that followed. Now we get to find out who we actually are. I finally understood, fully and completely, exactly what he had meant. And I understood, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, that the galaxy beyond that shimmering barrier had absolutely no idea what was about to come through it. The fleet crossed the seam at dawn, Earth time, though of course there was no true sunrise waiting on the far side, only the endless dark and the faint, ancient light of stars that had not looked upon a human face in more than 200 years. I stood on the bridge of the Dawn Unbroken beside Iris Voss, now an admiral, her hair gone gray but her eyes as sharp as they had been the night that first small scout made its crossing. Around us, arranged in careful formation, moved 42 vessels, the full strength of everything we had built during our exile. Warships and support craft and diplomatic vessels traveling together, a fleet built not for conquest but for something far more deliberate. "Sensors are picking up activity," a young officer reported, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. Multiple Accord vessels converging on our position. They've noticed us, Admiral. Iris did not flinch. Good, she said quietly. We didn't come here to sneak past them. Word had spread fast through Accord space in the hours after our crossing, exactly as we'd planned. We had made no attempt to hide, no effort to slip towards some concealed destination. Instead, our fleet broadcast a clear, calm signal on every frequency our scouts had identified. A message crafted with enormous care by Earth's diplomatic council, stating simply that humanity had returned to the region beyond the Shroud and requested a meeting with representatives of the Accord Tribunal. The first ships to intercept us belonged to an Accord border patrol, small and clearly outdated beside our own, their captains broadcasting frantic, confused demands that we halt and explain ourselves. Iris led our fleet slow, not stop, simply slow, a deliberate show that we were willing to speak but not willing to be commanded. This is Admiral Iris Voss of the Unified Human Fleet, she said. Her voice carried across every channel they were using. We are not here to threaten your border. We are here to speak with the tribunal that placed our species beneath the Shroud Protocol 206 years ago. We would prefer this handled peacefully. That choice, however, belongs to you. There was a long pause before the patrol commander answered, his voice tight with something between disbelief and fear. That is not possible. No vessel has crossed the Shroud in 2 centuries. Your technology should not exist. I remember the small, grim smile that crossed Iris's face. That, she said, is precisely the point we've come to make. Over the following days, as news of our return raced across Accord space faster than any official announcement could contain, our fleet made its slow, deliberate way toward the nearest major tribunal outpost, escorted by an ever larger, an ever more nervous crowd of Accord ships that seemed unsure whether they were guarding us or being watched in return. I spent much of that journey reviewing reports from our intelligence teams, who had spent years quietly learning how the galaxy had changed, or rather, how little it had. The Accord remained the dominant power across the region, but its structure had grown rigid, its senior species comfortable in positions of power they'd held for centuries without serious challenge. Several smaller species, ones who had never held much influence in the tribunal system, had grown quietly resentful of policies that always favored older, more established worlds. It was among these smaller species that our diplomats found the first thing we hadn't expected: genuine sympathy, even quiet admiration for what we had apparently accomplished during our exile. A representative from a small trading species called the Thren reached out during the journey, requesting a private channel that Iris allowed me to help conduct, given my long history with the original proceedings. We remember your case, the Thren envoy told us, careful but sincere. Many of us believed the punishment was too severe, decided too quickly, out of fear rather than justice. We were not powerful enough to argue against it then. Perhaps things have changed. It was a small conversation, but it planted something important in my mind. The realization that the galaxy we were returning to was not a single unified wall standing against us, but a tangled web of different species, different interests, and very different opinions about what had been done to us 2 centuries before. The tribunal outpost itself, when we finally reached it, was larger and better defended than the small monitoring stations our scouts had found near the Shroud. But even here, I could see the marks of a civilization that had grown comfortable rather than kept advancing. Its defenses, while respectable, followed design philosophies that had not meaningfully changed in generations. Lena Marsh, watching the same readings from a support vessel, sent Iris a message I happened to see during that tense approach. Their armor uses the same base composition it did 200 years ago, small refinements only. We passed this level decades ago and kept going. Nobody aboard our fleet felt anything like arrogance reading that. If anything, it deepened the quiet sorrow many of us carried. The understanding that our exile, our suffering, Our 2 centuries of hardship had happened at the hands of a civilization that had simply stopped pushing itself the moment it removed the one thing it found unpredictable. The meeting itself took place in a chamber not unlike the one I had stood in as a young man, though this one had clearly been prepared in haste, not built to host a delegation of our size on short notice. Once again, I found myself standing before a panel of judges, though not a single face among them was one I recognized from that first terrible day. 2 centuries had passed for them as well, even if their alien lifespans made the passage feel different than it did for the handful of us who remembered the original verdict firsthand. Iris Voss stood at the center of our delegation, though she had insisted quietly and firmly that I stand beside her, since I was among the very few humans present who had witnessed both the beginning of our exile and, we hoped, its end. The presiding judge, a younger member of the same granite-skinned species as the one who had sentenced us so long ago, studied our delegation with an expression I found hard to read. "You return after 206 years, he said, with a fleet, unannounced, uninvited, demanding an audience. Many on this tribunal see this as confirmation of everything we originally feared about your kind." Iris's answer was calm, measured, and utterly without apology. "We return after 206 years of enduring a punishment handed down with no defined end, no path to release, and no thought for what such isolation might create in a species left entirely to its own resources. We did not come uninvited. We came because your own law stated we would remain exiled until this tribunal determined we had become safe. Since no representative of this body ever returned to make that determination, we have made it necessary to determine it together." A long, tense silence filled the chamber. I watched the judges trade glances, some plainly uncertain, others visibly resistant to the very idea that a species they had dismissed as dangerous and primitive could speak to them with this kind of composed authority. "Your fleet alone," another judge said at last, an older being with pale, translucent skin, "demonstrates a level of military capability that concerns this tribunal deeply. How are we to trust a species that arrives armed rather than empty-handed?" This time I stepped forward, feeling the weight of 2 centuries settle into my voice. "Because we learned the hard way exactly what happens to a species that arrives without the means to protect itself," I said. "We were judged unsafe over a single tragic misunderstanding, given no path toward correction, and sealed away for 200 years with no promise anyone would ever check on us again. We built what we built because we had no other choice. We did not build it to threaten this tribunal. We built it because we refused to ever again stand in a chamber like this one, powerless, waiting for strangers to decide our fate." The debate that followed stretched across several long, difficult days, thick with old fears resurfacing alongside newer, quieter voices arguing that a species capable of what we had accomplished deserved, at the very least, the chance to be heard as equals rather than prisoners. And it was during those days that the true depth of our transformation became clear, not through any display of force, but through simple, patient demonstration. Our diplomats shared carefully chosen records of our history behind the shroud, not to boast, but to explain. We showed them the schools, the hospitals, the unified government, the culture of relentless self-improvement that had grown from isolation rather than despair. We showed them Vera Sato's early reactor designs, Lena Marsh's advanced plating, Alice Renner's small mountain school that had never once closed its doors through decades of hardship. Slowly, carefully, the tone in the chamber began to shift, not because every judge suddenly trusted us, but because the evidence made it impossible to keep pretending we were the same frightened, uncertain species they had exiled 2 centuries before. On the final day of that long negotiation, the presiding judge, the younger granite-skinned representative who had first addressed us, looked out across our delegation with an expression that finally seemed closer to respect than to fear. "This tribunal acknowledges," he said slowly, that the punishment placed upon your species was severe, poorly defined, and left without proper oversight. We acknowledge that your survival and your growth during that period were achieved entirely through your own effort, without guidance or support from this body." He paused, glancing at his fellow judges. "The question before us now is not whether your exile should end. That much has become clear. The true question, Elias Crane, Admiral Voss, is what role your species intends to play in this galaxy going forward, now that you have returned as something so far removed from the frightened, uncertain people we once turned away." Iris Voss did not answer at once. She let the silence stretch long enough that every judge understood we would not be rushed into a decision the way we had been rushed 2 centuries earlier, when a frightened young man named Elias Crane stood alone in a chamber like this one with no fleet behind him and no history to point to except a single tragic afternoon. "Humanity does not seek membership within the Accord as it currently stands," she finally said, and I watched several judges shift uncomfortably at the bluntness of it. "We do not ask to be readmitted as a lesser, junior species grateful for permission to rejoin a system that abandoned us without explanation for 200 years. We are prepared, instead, to establish formal relations with the Accord as an independent sovereign power, on equal standing, with our own territory, our own laws, and our own fleet, exactly as any other established civilization in this galaxy maintains." The reaction was immediate and divided. Several older judges reacted with open alarm, plainly uneasy at a species they had once dismissed as primitive now demanding equal footing rather than humble gratitude. Others, the younger judges, and several observing delegates from smaller species like the Thren envoy I had spoken with, seemed almost relieved, as though they had been waiting for someone to finally say it this plainly within these walls. "This is an extraordinary demand," the pale, translucent judge said, his voice tight with barely held frustration. "You ask this tribunal to treat your species as an equal power after a single fleet crossed our border unannounced. Equal standing is earned through generations of demonstrated cooperation, not claimed through one bold act of defiance." I stepped forward again, feeling the same weight I had felt in that first chamber so long ago, though this time it settled differently across my shoulders, less like a burden and more like something I had finally grown strong enough to carry. "With great respect," I said, "equal standing was never offered to us as something to be earned gradually and fairly. It was denied entirely the moment a single misunderstanding occurred during our very first years of contact with this galaxy. You did not give us the chance to demonstrate growth over generations. You took that chance from us completely and left us to build an entire civilization in isolation. And we have done exactly that. What you are looking at today is not one bold act of defiance. It is 200 years of demonstrated cooperation, discipline, and growth, achieved entirely among ourselves, because you left us no other option." The chamber fell silent once more, and this time the silence carried a different weight, something closer to reluctant acknowledgement than to open resistance. It took 3 more days of careful negotiation before the tribunal reached its final decision. 3 days in which I watched Iris Voss, Lena Marsh, and dozens of other human representatives handle every difficult question, every lingering doubt, with a patience and clarity that would have seemed impossible to the frightened, struggling people we had been in those first hard decades. We were not asking to be forgiven. We were presenting ourselves plainly, as we had actually become, and letting the tribunal decide whether it was ready to accept that reality. On the final day, the presiding judge addressed our full delegation one last time, his voice carrying a formality that told me he understood exactly how much this moment meant, not only for humanity, but for the future shape of the entire Accord. "After extensive deliberation," he said, "this tribunal formally acknowledges the sovereignty of the human collective, effective immediately. The Shroud Protocol is permanently rescinded." Human territory, including your home system and all established colonies, is recognized as independent, self-governed space, protected under the same treaties and mutual defense agreements extended to any established accord power. He paused. Furthermore, given the technological and organizational capability demonstrated in these proceedings, this tribunal extends a formal invitation for the human collective to take part in future Accord Council sessions, not as a petitioning species, but as an invited equal. I don't think I truly believed it, not fully, until Iris turned to me afterward, her composed expression finally breaking into something close to disbelief and quiet joy. "We did it, Elias," she said softly. "After everything, we actually did it." News of the decision spread across Accord space within days, and the reaction, as our intelligence had warned, was far from unanimous. Several older, established species reacted with open concern, uneasy at the sudden arrival of a sovereign power whose full capabilities remained largely unknown to them. Others, particularly the smaller species long overlooked in the Accord's rigid hierarchy, reached out to our delegation almost at once, eager to open trade and diplomatic ties with a civilization that had proven, beyond any doubt, what determination and unity could accomplish under the harshest conditions. The Thren envoy who had first reached out during our journey became one of humanity's earliest and most enthusiastic allies, her people quickly establishing trade agreements that benefited both our civilizations enormously. Within the first year, similar agreements followed with a dozen other small species, all of them drawn to us not out of fear, but out of genuine respect for what we represented. Proof that a civilization did not need centuries of slow, cautious growth under someone else's guidance to become powerful, wise, and worthy of equal standing. I returned to Earth roughly 18 months after that final decision, older now by every measure except the strange extended years our medicine had granted me. I remember standing once again on that same observation deck, where Vera Sato and I had watched the shroud first begin to close so many decades before. The sky above Earth looked different now, filled not with the faint silver scar of an alien barrier, but with the steady, confident movement of human vessels traveling openly between our system and the wider galaxy, a sight that would have seemed impossible to the frightened young man I had once been. Vera herself, remarkably still alive thanks to the very medical advances her early work had helped make possible, joined me on that deck. Her hair was fully white now, her hands still marked by the decades-old burns she had never bothered to hide. "Do you remember what you said to me?" she asked. "The night the shroud started closing." I remembered every word. I said we'd better learn to live without them. She smiled, looking out at the ships moving steadily across the dark. "You were right," she said. "We did learn to live without them, and in doing it we became something they never expected, something far stronger than the species they were so afraid of in the first place." I think often about that conversation now, many years later, as I sit here recording these memories for whoever might one day wish to understand exactly how humanity's exile truly ended. We were not rescued. We were not forgiven out of pity or some sudden change of heart among our former judges. We simply grew patiently, relentlessly, until the very civilization that had once cast us aside had no choice but to recognize what we had become. Today humanity holds a respected, influential place within the wider Accord Council, our territory reaching far beyond the boundaries of our original solar system, our fleet counted among the most capable and disciplined forces in this entire region of the galaxy. Younger species now study our history not as a cautionary tale about unpredictable violence, but as an example of resilience, unity, and the astonishing potential that lives within a civilization determined to prove itself worthy on its own terms, rather than waiting for permission that might never come. I am an old man now, older than any human was ever meant to live, and I have spent these final years traveling between the worlds our people fought so hard to reach. Meeting the descendants of those first frightened colonists who once huddled behind a barrier they never chose. Watching them stand now as equals among species who once thought of us as little more than a dangerous mistake. They wanted us gone, all those centuries ago. They wanted a species too fast, too unpredictable, too dangerous to be trusted, sealed away quietly where it could no longer threaten the comfortable order they had built for themselves. 200 years later, they welcomed us instead as something they never expected. Not a plague to be feared, not a threat to be contained, but a nation standing proudly on its own foundation, whether the rest of the galaxy had truly wanted that outcome or not. And as I look out now across the vast open stars that once felt so completely beyond our reach, I finally understand, fully and completely, exactly what my father meant on that first cold night so long ago, when everything we knew seemed lost, and everything we would one day become was still waiting, quietly and patiently, for its chance to finally